Hari Om. We begin with the next lesson known as the menstrual cycle. Let us first define what the menstrual cycle is. Menstrual cycle is defined as periodic changes seen both in females, human females, as well as female primates. Okay, it is found in human beings as well as primates. Primates means apes. So periodic changes seen in humans and primates, female, where changes are observed both in the primary and secondary sex organs, repeated in a cyclic manner. These changes are seen in a cyclic manner, and the duration of the cycle lasts for 28 days. 28 days is equal to one lunar month, and one lunar month is known as a mensum. Cyclically, these changes are observed lasting for 28 days, and it ends with the discharge of blood through the vagina, referred as the menstrual flow. So there are quite a large number of parameters as far as this definition is concerned. Let us dissect it bit by bit and we'll understand it better. Periodic changes. You understand what periodic changes are. And where do we find it? In female, human beings as well as primates. Now, what is happening during these periodic changes? There are changes, characteristic changes observed both in the primary and secondary sex organs. Primary sex organ means the ovary. Changes happen in the ovary, and in the secondary sex organ. Secondary sex organ means the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, as well as the mammary glands. So changes are observed not only in the ovary but also in the secondary sex organs. And how long does the cycle happen? The cycle is repeated every 28 days. Okay, it begins on a particular day and the entire cycle lasts for 28 days, and it ends with the discharge of blood called as the menstrual flow. It is discharged through the vagina. Now, let us see, when does the menstrual cycle actually begin in human females? When a girl approaches puberty, when she reaches the age of around 12, 13 or 14, the first menstrual cycle is observed, and that period is called as the menarche. So the menstrual cycle begins for menarche, and it is repeated from that particular age of 12 or 13 regularly for 28 days. Periodic changes are observed and the cycle keeps repeating till the female attains the age of around 50 and 55, when there is a sudden cessation. The sudden cessation or stopping of the menstrual cycle is called as the menopause. So we begin the menstrual cycle from menarche, and it continues for a period till 50 to 55, known as the menopause. So this period between menarche and menopause, say around 13 years of age till around 55 years of age, this period is known as the reproductive life of a female. That is the time when she is reproductively active. So these are certain important parameters with respect to the menstrual cycle. Similar to the menstrual cycle, there is what is known as the estrous cycle. The estrous cycle is seen in non-primates. It is very similar where changes happen in the primary and secondary sex organ. The only difference is in the estrous cycle, the endometrium or the uterine epithelium is not discharged out as menstrual flow. In this case, in the case of menstrual cycle, it is discharged out as menstrual flow, but in the estrous cycle, which happens in non-primates, it is absorbed back. That is, the uterine epithelial endometrium is absorbed back and it is not discharged. So that is the basic difference between the two. The menstrual cycle can be learned under 4 phases. For the sake of convenience, we can learn it under 4 phases. Let us see what are these phases. The first phase is called as the proliferative or the follicular phase. This phase lasts for 10 to 12 days. Now, the first day of the proliferative phase is actually the first day where the menstrual flow is observed. Meaning, suppose, say a girl experiences her menstrual flow or the discharge of blood on the 1st of October. Okay. So, that day, 1st of October is considered as day 1 of the proliferative phase. Is that clear? So, proliferative phase lasts for 10 to 12 days. Taking the previous example, so in this particular case, it is lasting from 1st of October till say 10th or 12th of October. That is called as a proliferative phase. So, proliferative phase is the first phase which is calculated on the first day when the female experiences the discharge of blood through the vagina. Coming to the second phase. The second phase is called as the ovulatory phase. The ovulatory phase actually lasts for just 3 days. Though it is called as a phase, it has only 3 days and it is just on the 12th, 13th and the 14th day of that particular cycle. Taking the previous example, if we had the proliferative phase from the 1st of October till the 12th of October, we have the ovulatory phase from the 12th to the 14th. So 12th, 13th and 14th are the 3 days when you have the ovulatory phase where ovulation actually happens. Coming to the next phase. The next phase is called as a luteal or the secretory phase. What happens during this phase? I mean, how long does it last? Secretory phase lasts for again 12 to 14 days. Okay, soon after the ovulatory phase, we begin with the secretory phase which lasts for 12 to 14 days. And taking the previous example, if the ovulatory phase was on October 14th, from October 14th till 14 days, meaning till October 28th, we have the luteal phase. So, luteal phase is for 12 to 14 days. And last we have the menstrual or the bleeding phase. The bleeding phase lasts for 4 to 7 days. And this 4 to 7 days actually, it coincides with the proliferative phase. It is actually merging with the proliferative phase. Meaning, the first day of the menstrual phase is actually the first day of the proliferative stage. So, this and this is actually merging with one another. But for the sake of convenience for explanation, we have divided it into 4 phases. So, the last phase is a menstrual phase which coincides with the proliferative phase. So, if you calculate the number of days, you will find that here till proliferative phase is 12 days. By the time we reach ovulatory phase is 14 days. By the time we reach the luteal phase, it is another 14 days. So, 14 plus 14, 28 days. And hence the cycle is completed. Menstrual phase coincides with the proliferative phase. Let us now study what exactly happens during the proliferative phase. Now, the proliferative phase is also called as the follicular phase and it lasts for 10 to 12 days. Let's see what happens now. The hypothalamus, we have already learnt the hormonal control of the reproductive system. The hypothalamus produces the hormone called as GnRH or the gonadotropin releasing hormone. This releasing hormone reaches the anterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary is now stimulated to produce 2 hormones, namely the follicle stimulating hormone FSH and the LH or the luteinizing hormone. So gradually there is a increase in the titer value of both these hormones in the bloodstream. These hormones reach the ovary. That's the site of influence of the hormone is the ovary. So the FSH and the LH reach the ovary, and within the ovary you may recollect that there are the ovarian follicles developing, the primary to the secondary to the tertiary. Now, one of these tertiary ovarian follicles within the ovary is influenced by the FSH, and that tertiary ovarian follicle now matures itself into a Graafian follicle. And what is developing inside the tertiary ovarian follicle? The secondary oocyte is developing inside the tertiary ovarian follicle. That is now maturing into a Graafian follicle. So that maturation happens because of the influence of FSH. Now recollect the definition. Periodic changes which occur where changes are observed in the primary sex organ. See, the primary sex organ, there are changes happening. The ovarian follicle is now growing in size and it is maturing, and within that there is a secondary oocyte also developing. Now, other than the secondary oocyte which is developing, the remaining cells of the follicles, which are called as the follicular cells, these follicular cells now become endocrine in nature and starts producing the female hormone called as estrogen. And under the influence of estrogen, a number of changes are observed in the secondary sex organ. Likewise, the luteinizing hormone which is produced also reaches the ovary, and this luteinizing hormone during this phase does not have much of an influence, but there is a gradual increase in the luteinizing hormone. So these are the changes happening in the presence of FSH on the primary sex organ.
Let us see what happens during the proliferative or the follicular phase. Now, during this phase, which lasts for 10 to 12 days, starting from the first day of the menstrual phase, meaning the first day when bleeding is observed, begins the proliferative stage. Now, we saw that a secondary oocyte starts developing within the Graafian follicle, and the rest of the follicular cells start producing estrogen. Under the influence of estrogen, a number of changes are observed within the secondary sex organs. Now, what are these changes? We saw that the FSH causes changes in the primary sex organ or the ovary, but the estrogen are causing certain changes in the secondary sex organs. The first changes: during the previous menstrual flow, there has been the rupture of the blood vessels within the uterine endometrium, and all these blood vessels which were ruptured are now getting repaired under the influence of estrogen by quick proliferation. So there is quick division of the cells, and this division of the cells repairs all the blood vessels which were ruptured during the previous menstrual flow. So that's the first change. The second change is the endometrial wall, which was released or which was sloughed away during the previous menstrual flow, is once again getting repaired, and repair happens through proliferation. So this is the second change. The third change is the vaginal wall, which was slightly discharged away, is getting repaired by proliferation. The uterus shows several glands, and these glands start developing. They become glandular and secretory in nature during the proliferative phase. The estrogen influences the myometrium. And when the myometrium, I hope you recollect what the myometrium is. The myometrium is the second wall of the uterus, the innermost being the endometrium. The middle wall is the myometrium. The myometrium is influenced by the estrogen, and there is slight increase in the uterine movement. So there is a gentle uterine movement. The uterus starts moving gently. It is not very visible, but there is an internal movement. Similarly, estrogen causes increase in the ciliary activity of the fallopian tube. Within the fallopian tube, there are cilia, and all the ciliary activity, all the cilia starts, beating. Slightly they start becoming active within the fallopian tube. The last change that is observed is the mammary glands, the alveoli start increasing in number. So quite a large number of changes. You will observe all these changes in the secondary sex organ. All of them are happening due to the production of estrogen by the follicular cells. And this happens during the proliferative phase. So why it is called as proliferative? Because in all the cases you find that it is reparative, and reparation is happening through proliferation. That is why it is called as proliferative. Why it is called as follicular phase? Because it is the follicular cells responsible for the production of the sex hormone estrogen, under the influence of which all these changes are materializing. That is the reason why it is called as the follicular phase.
Let us now see what happens during the ovulatory phase. The ovulatory phase, as we discussed earlier, is a very short phase which happens just for 3 days, the 12th, 13th or the 14th day. What happens during this particular phase? The GnRH, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, influences the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary is producing FSH and LH. We saw that the FSH has a direct influence on the ovary, causing it to mature the tertiary ovarian follicle into a Graafian follicle. What happens to the luteinizing hormone? The luteinizing hormone reaches the matured Graafian follicle, and during this particular phase, there is a sudden spurt or a sudden increase in the luteinizing hormone, causing the Graafian follicle to rupture. And in the process of rupturing, the secondary oocyte is liberated out. That process is known as ovulation. So, theoretically speaking, ovulation happens midway of the menstrual cycle. Midway of the menstrual cycle is actually the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. So if you are asked when exactly does ovulation happen, theoretically it happens on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. But there may be cases where the ovulation may either happen on the 12th day, the 13th day, 14th day or 15th day. So, but typically speaking, theoretically speaking, it happens on the 14th day. And how does it happen? It happens because of the surge of the luteinizing hormone, and this surge influences the Graafian follicle to rupture. The process of rupture is known as ovulation, and ovulation results in the release of the secondary oocyte. What happens next is the Graafian follicle, the remaining follicular cells, continue to produce the female hormone called as estrogen, and many changes are observed in the secondary sex organ under the influence of estrogen.
Let us now discuss what are the changes that happen during the ovulatory phase. Now I hope you remember that the ovulatory phase happens ovulation happens either on the 12th, 13th or the 14th, but theoretically speaking it is on the 14th day. During this phase, the follicular cells are still producing estrogen. Though the Graafian follicle has ruptured, releasing the secondary oocyte, the follicular cells continue to produce estrogen, and there is an increase in the production of estrogen. And this estrogen, what happens? Under the influence of estrogen, the following changes are once again observed. The blood vessels which were ruptured, which had already started its repair, is now getting completely repaired. All the blood vessels are completely repaired. The endometrial wall, which was in the process of becoming proliferated, is completely proliferated, and the uterine endometrial wall becomes thickened to the maximum. The third change is the vaginal wall is also completing its reparative process. So there is complete repair of the endometrium, the blood vessels, as well as the vaginal wall. The uterine glands develop to the maximum and they become highly secretory. The myometrium, which was influenced by the estrogen, is still being influenced, and that causes the maximum uterine movement. The ciliary activity of the fallopian tube is also maximized. Then the mammary alveoli, which had started developing in the proliferative stage, has increased in number to the maximum. So we find that whatever has started during the proliferative stage is continuing, and it is attaining its maximum development during the ovulatory phase. Now, for a moment think, why are these changes happening? Why is the body or the uterus behaving in this manner? This is because all these changes are in anticipation of insemination and subsequent fertilization. During the ovulatory phase, if in case insemination has happened, obviously there are chances for the sperm to move from the vagina to the uterus, and the uterine movement will hasten up the movement of the sperms towards the fallopian tube, towards the ampullary isthmic junction. Similarly, since ovulation has already happened, the ova or the secondary oocyte, which is released from the Graafian follicle, would also start moving through the fallopian tube, because there is quick ciliary activity of the fallopian tube. So the ovum is moving through the fallopian tube to the ampullary isthmic junction, and the sperm is also moving towards the ampullary isthmic junction. So there are possibilities of fertilization. So during the ovulatory phase, all these changes are maximized in anticipation of insemination. But then you know that during the reproductive period that extends between menarche, and menopause, the chances of insemination and subsequent fertilization may be limited to probably 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 times. And hence, you find that though it is restricted, the body is preparing itself for fertilization and subsequent pregnancy. So that is why such changes are observed during the ovulatory phase.
Let us now discuss what happens during the luteal phase. During the luteal phase, remember, in the previous phase, that is the ovulatory phase, there is the rupture of the Graafian follicle, and the rupture of the Graafian follicle releases the secondary oocyte. What happens to this Graafian follicle? The Graafian follicle remains in the ovary, and it is now converted into another endocrine gland called as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces the female sex hormone, the next female sex hormone called as progesterone. Under the influence of progesterone, once again a number of changes are observed in the female reproductive system. Now, These changes may last for 12 to 14 days. In normal situations, it lasts for 10 to 14 days. However, there are exceptions. What are the exceptions? If pregnancy had occurred, then the luteal phase is extended to almost 6 months and the progesterone is continuously produced for 6 months, which causes the pregnancy to be maintained. And that is the reason why progesterone is also called as the pregnancy hormone. But in normal cases, it lasts only for 12 to 14 days of the menstrual cycle.
Let us now see what happens, what are the changes that are observed during the luteal phase. The luteal phase lasts for 12 to 14 days. And the luteal phase, once the ovum is or the secondary oocyte is released from the Graafian follicle, the Graafian follicle converts itself to another structure which is endocrine in nature called as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces a hormone, the sex hormone called as progesterone. Under the influence of progesterone, the following changes are observed in the secondary sex organs. Uterine movement are getting reduced. We saw that in the previous two phases, uterine movement were maximized. But during this phase, the uterine movement are quietened. It is reduced. The ciliary action of the fallopian tube is also reduced. The uterine glands which have started becoming active continue to remain active and continue to produce their glandular secretions. The endometrium, which was thickened to the maximum, remains in that thickened nature. And the blood vessels, which were all repaired, is keeping the endometrium in a highly vascularized condition. So all these changes are effected due to the production of progesterone. Now, why is the body or why is the uterus as well as the secondary sex organ behaving in this manner? This is because in case there had been insemination and fertilization, definitely the body should be preparing for implantation. The zygote has to implant itself in the uterine wall and develop into an embryo and a fetus. So these changes are happening during the luteal phase in anticipation of implantation leading to pregnancy. Now, why is it this phase called as a luteal phase? It is called as a luteal phase because the corpus luteum is responsible for the production of progesterone, which brings about these changes. Why is it called as secretory phase? It is called as a secretory phase because the corpus luteum secretes the progesterone, bringing about these changes. Let us see what happens if implantation had occurred. If implantation had occurred, the luteal phase is extended to almost 6 months and the corpus luteum continue to produce progesterone in order to maintain pregnancy. Now remember that this condition may not happen during every cycle. It happens only very rarely, only when there is a chance for pregnancy. So if implantation has happened, the luteal phase is extended to 6 months because for the 6 months, the corpus luteum has to produce progesterone, which is needed to maintain pregnancy. And because of this particular function, progesterone is also called as the pregnancy hormone.
We come to the last phase, that's the menstrual phase. In normal situations, when pregnancy does not happen, what happens is the menstrual phase sets in. During this phase, there is a gradual degeneration of the Graafian follicle. The Graafian follicle starts degenerating And in the absence of Graafian follicle, automatically there is a decline in the progesterone production. So progesterone production decreases. And when progesterone production decreases, the endometrial wall which had thickened earlier cannot be maintained, and the blood vessels which were already repaired cannot be maintained in the absence of progesterone. So what happens now is the absence or the gradual decline of the progesterone causes the rupture of the blood vessels within the uterine epithelium, as well as the endometrium which has already thickened is also gradually getting sloughed away. The sloughed away endometrium as well as the ruptured blood vessels are discharged out through the vagina, called as the menstrual flow, and that lasts for 4 to 7 days. Obviously, you must remember that the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase overlap with one another. So this phase where there is a discharge of blood may last for 4 to 7 days. In some individuals for 4 days, for some others it may extend till 7 days also. So this is known as the bleeding phase or the menstrual phase. When there is a reduction in progesterone, this feeds back on the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus once again starts producing GnRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary now starts producing FSH and LH, and that again initiates the next menstrual cycle. So that is the reason why we say that whenever there is a menstrual phase, automatically it is coinciding with the next proliferative phase, and the only reason is because of the increase in FSH production. So it is one phase ends and the next phase, one cycle ends and the next cycle begins. The menstrual phase and the proliferative phase actually coincides with one another.
What are the changes which happen during the menstrual or the bleeding phase? The menstrual or the bleeding phase happens or lasts for 4 to 7 days. During this period, there is a gradual degeneration of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum degenerates. When the corpus luteum degenerates, obviously there is a gradual decline in the production of progesterone. And this progesterone, when it starts declining or decreasing, there are certain changes observed in the uterus. Now, corpus luteum gradually degenerates and it is converted into a scar tissue called as the corpus albicans. Let us see what happens when there is an absence of progesterone during the menstrual phase. In the absence of progesterone, the uterine blood vessels cannot be maintained there, and immediately these blood vessels now start rupturing. Rupture of blood vessels obviously leads to release of blood from the blood vessels. The endometrium also cannot be maintained within the uterus and gradually is sloughed away. So the sloughed away endometrium and the ruptured blood vessel is discharged. When the blood vessels are ruptured, blood is discharged. So the blood along with the endometrium is discharged out of the body through the vagina, and this is called as the menstrual flow, which may actually last for 4 to 7 days. Now from this you will notice that the entire menstrual cycle is dependent on nothing but hormones. All the changes in the body are because of certain increase or decrease of hormones, which bring about certain changes in both the primary as well as the secondary sex organs. There is the absence of menstruation in a female during certain conditions. Obviously, the first is pregnancy. Whenever there is pregnancy, there is no menstrual cycle observed. Similarly, after an age of 50 to 55, there is a sudden cessation of the menstrual cycle. The sudden cessation of the menstrual cycle is called as menopause. The third reason is if a woman experiences poor health condition, if the nutritional status is very low, then there may be the absence of the menstrual cycle. Similarly, stress. If there's a woman under terrible stress, that can disrupt the normal menstrual cycle. And after gestation period, after the baby is born, when the baby is subjected to intense lactation, or when the baby is provided with mother's milk, then during this period again there is the absence of the menstrual cycle. Menstruation is absent during intense lactation. This depicts a very wonderful diagrammatic representation of the menstrual cycle. Now you will find that along this axis the pituitary hormones are depicted, the ovarian events, what happens in the ovary is depicted, what are the ovarian hormones which are released, and what are the uterine events that are depicted. So you will find that here there is the depiction of the hormones, and here starting from day 1 to day 28, what are the different events which are happening in the primary sex organ or the ovary, as well as the secondary sex organ, mainly the uterine epithelium. Let us see what happens. The pituitary hormone is released. If you recollect, the GnRH influences the anterior pituitary to release both the FSH and the LH. The red line represents the FSH production and the blue line represents the LH production. So there is an increase in the FSH and LH, and under the influence of FSH, we find that there is the ovarian follicle which is gradually maturing itself and developing into a Graafian follicle. So this happens under the influence of the FSH. And as the follicles are developing, we also have studied that the remaining cells other than the secondary oocyte, the remaining follicular cells starts to produce the ovarian hormone called as the estrogen. So here this blue line represents the increase in the estrogen production. Under the influence of estrogen, let us see what is happening to the uterine epithelium. This depicts the menstrual flow, and when the estrogen is produced, there is the gradual repair of the blood vessels which is seen inside the uterus, inside the uterine epithelium. You will also find a gradual thickening of the uterine endometrium. So all this comes under the proliferative or the follicular phase. Let us see what happens next. By the time we reach the 14th day, see, follicular phase under the influence of estrogen happens for 14 days. On the 14th day, there is a sudden surge of luteinizing hormone. See, this blue line on the 14th day is increasing. There is a sudden surge. This sudden surge of luteinizing hormone causes the Graafian follicle to rupture, and that process is called as ovulation. However, the remaining follicular cells continue to produce estrogen, and under the presence of estrogen, you find that the endometrial wall remains thickened. The blood vessels are also repaired to the maximum. So there is maximum development of the endometrial wall. Next, what happens? The Graafian follicle, once the Graafian follicle has ruptured, the Graafian follicle is now converted into a corpus luteum, and this corpus luteum starts producing progesterone. So you'll find that the progesterone level, which is rather low in the initial phases, is now gradually increasing when the corpus luteum is developing. Under the influence of progesterone, what do we notice? We notice that the thickening is maintained and the blood vessels are also developing to the maximum. The endometrial wall remains thickened to the maximum in anticipation of implantation. So this phase, when there is increased production of progesterone, is called as the luteal phase. But the chances of fertilization and implantation is remote. So what happens is the corpus luteum gradually starts degenerating and it becomes a scar tissue called as the corpus albicans. When the corpus luteum starts degenerating, the progesterone level goes down. When the progesterone level goes down, automatically the endometrial wall cannot be maintained. The blood vessels cannot be maintained and there is rupture. So this phase, when there is a rupture, is called as the bleeding phase. And the phase when there is the support of the corpus luteum with the production of progesterone is called as the luteal phase. So the luteal phase continues for 14 days and we reach the end of the cycle, that is on the 28th day. And when the 28th day there is the discharge of blood, automatically we understand that there is the next cycle beginning, or once again there is an increase in the FSH production. You will find, see, the red line is once again starting to increase, meaning the FSH production is again increasing, or we reach the next follicular phase of the next cycle, and this continues from menarche to menopause. So this pictorial representation gives us an overview of the different hormones produced by the pituitary gland as well as the ovarian follicles and the influence of these hormones on both the primary sex organs as well as the secondary sex organs. So basically, please understand that the entire menstrual cycle is dependent on FSH, LH, estrogen and progesterone.